Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. Dedicated to fostering a rational and evidence-based approach to Canadian security and defense, the CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. In today's episode, Vice Chair of the CDA Institute, Gord Venner, breaks down the 2024 strategic outlook with its authors, Ferry de Kerkhoff and George Petrolikis. They'll discuss the strength of multilateral organizations, geopolitical tension in the Middle East, and climate change as the threat multiplier. This is the Expert Series.
Day. My name is Gordon Venner, and I'm the Vice Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Conference of Defense Associations Institute, which is the Ottawa-based think tank which focuses on defense and national security issues. In this CDAI podcast, I'm joined by Ferry de Kerkhoff, a retired Canadian diplomat and former ambassador, and George Petrolikis, a retired Canadian Army colonel and a former senior executive in the telecommunications industry. For the 2024 edition of its annual policy conference, the CDA asked these two experts to prepare a strategic overview and analysis of the global security climate. This paper, which I recommend to all of our listeners, helped inform the discussion at the CDAI conference in March. Today, we will discuss that paper, drawing as well on the discussions which took place in the conference panels, seminars, and keynote addresses. I want to begin our discussion not at the beginning of your paper, but about 40 pages in, where you start to discuss the unprecedented challenge to multilateralism arising from the current global security climate. As with most discussions and considerations of multilateral approaches to global problems, the analysis begins with the United Nations. So let's start with whether or not the UN is still fit for purpose. Current issues like the war in Ukraine, for example, remind us that the United Nations Security Council is not an obvious candidate to lead on the resolution of some security problems, given its composition. But this is hardly a new issue. So why do you think that the current challenges are especially problematic for the UN?
I think the fundamental problem we have in the multilateral system is, as we say in the strategic outlook, the fact that we have two levels of decision, one which is an executory one, that is the Security Council, and the other is the General Assembly, which has no power to impose any decision. So that's the foundational side of it. And then we have, if you go throughout the ages of the UN, it's not as if today was the most horrific time. There's been some dispute ever since the Cold War emerged. But I think today, the fact that the other powers, that is China and Russia, are really opposed to the structure that emerged from 1945, explain the intensity of the real hostility between those two prime countries and what we call the reasonable one, that is the US and the Western world. And I think that's the start of a discussion. But at the same time, it's not new. If you look, for instance, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the US has had over 1,000 veto on a resolution made in order to try and create the two-state solution. Russia has used the veto extensively as well. So it's not as what is different is the change in the international structure, the relationship between great powers, the rejection of the UN system as it was created, and the weakening, the very real weakening of the US as a global power politically, not militarily, but politically. So I would start with that as the first elements of why the UN has changed so extensively, even though the structure of the UN itself has stayed the same. Maybe it should change, and all the institutions around it are still helping managing the global commons.
Thank you. George, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would actually. Thank you very much. And before I start, I think it just would behoove both of us to thank the CDAI for sponsoring this outlook again, as it has in previous years, and continues our cooperation. And the fact that it was presented at a conference that allowed many of these issues to be discussed is something that is necessary, and at least the CDAI does that, and does allow various interveners to discuss the major issues of the day. So that was a really powerful event for these issues that we're going to discuss. With respect to your question on multilateralism in the United Nations, it's not so much that the United Nations has become ineffective. It's that key nations that were pillars supporting the structure politically of the United Nations to solve issues have peeled away. And in part because certain nations not only rebelled against the structure that was set up after the Second World War, but in practice, throughout the 80s, the 90s, into the 2000s, they saw actions in the international community that didn't reflect the ideals of the UN, and were great powers used the UN just to support their particular point of view. For example, currently, parts of the UN or members of the UN, like the United States, rightly call the Ukraine war an illegal invasion of established territory. However, the Russians and the Chinese would also point to the Iraq war and say the exact same thing, and there were no consequences. The responsibility to protect, a Canadian developed doctrine that was used to protect civilians in Libya, went far beyond its remit. So you could see that people would look at that international system and say, exemplified by the UN, and say that you don't actually practice what you preach. You could look at other conflicts like Cyprus and the Turkish invasion of northern Cyprus, and it would be difficult to discern the differences between Turkey's actions in Cyprus and Russia's actions in the Ukraine. So what has changed is people no longer trust that framework of the UN. And now what has happened is that there are transactional alliances between major powers, and not just major powers. I mean, South Africa, for example, is aligning with the BRICS for different issues, completely different than what we call the Western world, which was the pillar of that international order. Having said that, the UN still is a remarkably potent and important organization. Where else would you find the interventions by the World Food Program, by UNHCR, by UNICEF for supporting children, fighting famine all over the world? And we forget in our day-to-day lives, every time we board an airplane, there would not be airplanes flying across the sky, across international borders, had it not been for the existence of ICAO. So the UN is covered by a broad brush of dismay with respect to multilateralism. It still exists. It still provides a very important function in the daily operation of the world and its crises. It has just been reduced politically, not because of the UN itself, but because of the member states that contribute to it.
Given the challenges the UN is facing, is there room for other multilateral institutions to do more? And I'm thinking, of NATO, of the Arab League, international courts. We could go on. Is there a bit of a vacuum there that some of these organizations could step into and help contribute to solutions to some of the most pressing problems?
The problem is that there is no alternative to the UN. So any institution, multilateral or otherwise, that you are referring to would be an addition. And if it became more potent, more capable, it could adduce to a better UN. If you take, for instance, the development of the European Union as a very exemplary institution where things are made in common politically. They're close to all of that. The Brexit was a disaster, which I think the Brits will regret time and again. But I think there's a series of other institutions, but there are some that are amazingly ineffective, even though they exist, and they've existed for quite a long time. Think of the Arab League, which I had the joy to attend meetings, which would put you to sleep better than any somnifere that you can find in a way. It's just amazing. And yet the notion of an Arab League is an important concept. And you would want to know, for instance, in the case of the present conflict in Gaza, have you heard anything from the Arab League of any significance, even though the head of the Arab League is Abu Ghait, who was the Egyptian foreign minister? So in terms of intellectual capability, it certainly exists. But I think that the realm of international organization or institution are remarkable, but they have not been put to the service of the broader community of the UN. The only one that comes, in fact, is the only military organization, which is NATO. There is no other organization as such. Even the old one from the Soviet Union time has withered away. And so that is an example of an institution that still works despite years and years and years of complaint from, I don't know, from Donald Trump onwards and before. So I think the problem is that there is no sense of transforming the structure of the international system, because the moment you touch an institution and try to see if you can mesh its action with another, that's when the problem occurs. So I think the problem we have is that there is no longer a multilateral consensus on the multilateral approach to managing issues. So that's why, to me, there's a lot of institutions that are very valuable and more are emerging, but they do not adduce to an improvement of the management of conflict by the UN. They have their own objective. And therefore, I think that it's an interesting idea, but I don't think there's much hope in improving the other institution as stabilizer, even though in their region, there are some elements that are working well. Think about all these old institutions that no longer exist, that the American established in the Middle East, for instance. Well, they've, the Baghdad Pact and all these, they serve their purpose and they withered away. Or take the African Union, for instance. You would expect the African Union to be a much more effective mechanism to regulate conflicts that are happening in Africa, but it's not happening either. So there's a dearth of willpower and there's a dearth of unity.
I agree with you, Ferry, 100%. And I just want to add on to one particular word that you said, and Gord, to also play on your last statement. If there wasn't a UN, we would fight to create it. All the institutions that you mentioned have or really are regionally based or single issue based. So the UN transcends political issues, transcends climate issues, transcends humanitarian issues, and it does so globally. NATO, which is a great organization where countries meet and frequently go beyond just the simple security structures that govern NATO, but NATO is still trying to find a role for itself, and I don't mean in Europe, but first of all, in conjunction with or in competition with the EU and European or emerging European defense structures, but then look across the Pacific to Asia and riddle us a role for NATO in that area. So again, there are structures, the African Union, great example from Ferry, but again, limited to the continent and the relations of the continent to global issues. But it doesn't capture the totality of the issues around the world, and only the UN, I think, is the body that can do that.
Okay, thank you both. So switching now to the second of your three issues, the Gaza war. Achieving Middle East peace has been synonymous with futility for a very long time. but in recent memory, it has perhaps never been as discouraging as it is right now. And I'm just struck that despite the fact that the Palestinians have long had professed friends in the region, and the Israelis have made some progress in building closer ties to more countries in the region, not just long-standing relationships like those with Jordan or Egypt, but more recent improvements with Gulf states or Saudi Arabia. That those new friendships have not resulted in the neighbors being able to help both sides move forward to a more to an enduring peace. And I wonder why that is. And is there any prospect for that situation to improve in the years ahead?
I'll crush the question by saying that the strike of genius, however much I regret its impact, is the Abraham Accords, which highlighted one fundamental thing, is that our Arab friends are prepared to pay lip service to the cause of the Palestinian, but are not prepared to put money and blood into achieving that. The Saudis are the only one remaining because there's some religious dimension, there's some leadership dimension, there's all of those elements that come into play. But fundamentally, the moment the Egyptian and the Jordanian recaptured their lost territories, the two-state solution was part of the harangue, the same way we have it in the West. But in fact, we're not putting much effort in achieving it. But I think that there's the fact that even for the Arabs, the Palestinian and others, it's always the US that has to deliver the product. And the US cannot deliver the product. It's on the ground that it has to be delivered. And this is why there has never been any progress. And you have to admit one thing, is that the Israeli have always made sure that no progress would ever be made in creating a Palestinian state. And in fact, we've discovered, I think, more forcibly in the last 5, 6, 7 years, that for Israel, the totality of the West Bank has to become eventually Israeli territory. And what happens to the Palestinian? Well, we don't really worry about that. That's something that the Jordanians can take them, let the Arab take them. There's something very vicious in that constant. But we have deliberately over time refused to recognize that that is the ultimate goal of the Israeli. And give credit to Bennett, give credit to even Netanyahu, which hurts me to say, that they've never hidden their view. They've toyed. Netanyahu twice in his tenure of 12, 15 years, I don't know, has uttered, yes, a two-state solution, but. And the buts were so gigantic that even a decent Palestinian would never take them on. And he did that being forced after the Obama speech in 2008. And at Bar Ilan, Netanyahu gave a speech where he said yes to state, but imposed so many deleterious conditions to the Palestinian that it would be an insult for the Palestinian to accept what Netanyahu was offering. And it continues. Meanwhile, you've got an expansion in the colonization, and the objective is the same. The question is, what do we do with the Palestinian? Are we going to have a second Nakba? Are they all going to be thrown into Jordan? The old theory of the Jordanians should take the Palestinians, and the 60% of their population is already Palestinian. So I think the prospect on that conflict are getting worse rather than better. The only thing that holds on to, and that's why I come back and to finish with the Abraham Accords, is that is the only leg that still stands, and that has a certain influence in the process. But the Saudis now, seeing the onslaught of Gaza, I think have firmed up their position. And I think they're going to be very, very hard to negotiate with, because it's not the Americans who are going to deliver a Palestinian state. Maybe the Saudis will.
Well, just before we go to you, George, I just push you a little bit further on the Saudis, Ferry. The Saudis have achieved over the last year a bit of a rapprochement with Iran. They're also, as you point out, in sort of a unique position now with respect to the Abraham Accords and going forward. But it's very easy to see that trying to walk both sides of that Iran-Israeli street could put the Saudis in a pretty tricky situation. If push comes to shove, which way do they go?
Well, first of all, let's remember that it's Chinese who brought the Iranian and the Saudis together, which I
Very
think
good
is
point.
a major feat that deserves to be underscored, because for once it's not the American. I think the bottom line with the Saudi will be the Saudi interest. And I think that at the end of the day, if they cannot forcibly, quote unquote, impose the emergence of a Palestinian state, rump size, whatever it was, I think the Saudis will eventually come back to the Abraham Accords writ large, and eventually something will have to be managed with the Palestinian. But I don't think the Saudis are going to prevent growing the way they are, expanding their horizon, expanding their capability, the networking in the region, all that, on the altar of the Palestinian. That is not going to obtain.
George?
There's not a whole lot to add. I think Ferry has it encapsulated completely. Look, there are two sides that just do not see the world the same way. No matter what logic you might try and impose, it just doesn't exist. When I heard a quote the other day, this was our land from 2,000 years ago. Well, it's kind of hard to fight that history when that's what you truly believe. And therefore, well, you may have lived there for the last 200 years, but it doesn't trump our 2,000-year legacy. And there's just no way of getting around that. It's two kids in the playpen that just one is a little bigger than the other kid in the playpen, and they can't figure out how to share and work around the toys that are inside that playpen. So it needs an adult to come out, look into that playpen and impose it. And that's if it's not the US, and it probably won't be, then it falls to, as Ferry said, the Saudis or some other grouping. But it is not going to come from an agreement within or between the Israelis and the Palestinians. As much as we'd like to believe that, as much as we can disengage and say, well, here's what is logical, that logic penetrates nowhere in between the two warring parties. And therefore, it's just going to have to be imposed. And the world at some point is going to have to express its disgust and just say, enough. Enough of this. We've had enough of tanker traffic being rerouted around the Cape of Good Horn and increasing price of oil. Enough with watching horrendous scenes of people being literally butchered through airstrike or allowed to starve, or Israel constantly being on the watch and its citizens being murdered overseas in different places by terrorists. There is no conceivable way that our logic puts them together, and therefore it will have to be imposed. And to do that will mean some really deep discussions amongst the nations that support the idea of some sort of agreement being reached, whether it's imposed or not. So Canada, and it's one of the things that we mentioned in one of our recommendations, particularly with respect to US efforts to broker the hostage release and impose at least a short ceasefire, hopefully that transforms into a longer ceasefire. We can certainly express our angst to the Prime Minister Netanyahu, but we need to be lockstep with the Americans and other allies in saying enough. We need to find an end to this.
Let me move on to the third issue that you identified, climate change. This is a little bit different than the last two we just discussed, but we've just finished the warmest winter in recorded Canadian history. And we are not alone in feeling the sometimes catastrophic effects of climate change. So maybe, George, if I could start with you, Maybe you could just remind our listeners of why this is a national security issue.
So it doesn't just affect us, it affects our neighbors. And it's one of the things that it's worth remembering, given that he just recently died. But Brian Mulroney absolutely recognized that when he negotiated the Acid Rain Treaty, that climate transcends borders. So it's not just a national issue, it becomes an international issue as well. Nationally, it becomes an issue for the Canadian Forces that we don't have the manpower, we don't have a system. Given the way powers are truncated between the different provinces of who has responsibility to fight fires and who has the responsibility to buy water bombers. Well, water bombers and those natural resources are a provincial responsibility. They're not federal, but they're coordinated and moved around. And then to put boots on the ground with a spade to actually dig out those fires, because it's not just a surface burn, it's an underground burn as well that can last for a long time, which requires somebody with a shovel to actually go and dig that those burning embers. Requires manpower, and the only organization that is capable of providing that manpower to do that is the Canadian Forces. But in order to do that, there's a price to be paid. So every time we send, whether it be a battalion or a brigade or some formation overseas on a mission, such as we are now in Latvia, it requires 3 times the troops. It's a 3-to-1 ratio of troops that are deployed, and then troops that are preparing to deploy, and then others that are just upping their personnel qualifications. If you take those troops away from that cycle, you disrupt the cycle of being able to meet the taskings that we've agreed to internationally, whether they be Latvia or anywhere else in the world that we have committed resources, or they tax resources to a degree that we can't take on new missions. And one of the most pertinent examples and proximate is our inability to actually provide forces and troops to Haiti, and the circumstances that are going literally in our own backyard, where we should have an interest in events in the Caribbean. So those are the manpower and proximate effects just of fires and things in the country, and how it spills over internationally, our ability to make commitments and the smoke and the pollution that's caused. But there are other factors as well from a national security standpoint. So as the temperatures rise, you start losing sea ice in the north. And one of the things that enables is passage through what is in essence what we think is all our territory, but it's undefined internationally, whether those are Canadian waters through the Canadian archipelago, Northern Archipelago, or whether they're international waters. But now we would have to have an ability that we really ignored before. I remember years ago, a chief of defense staff said that if there was a Russian incursion in Canada's Arctic, he would probably have to send a search and rescue mission. Well, now we need a little bit more than that. We need the ability to surveil it. And if you surveil something, then you need to be able to act on it. So if you're going to act on it with what? Are you going to act on it with troops? Or are you going to act on it with ships? And if it's going to be ships, then you need to have ships that are capable of at least being able to navigate in first-year ice. If it's going to be with aircraft, you need airplanes that have the legs and the ability or the range to be able to fly and actually have an effect up there. Or you open up northern airfields to allow to put sea lanes and the Arctic archipelago within the range of the aircraft that you're sending up there. The airplanes just don't fly magically for 18, 19, and 20 hours without being refueled. So all those things have an impact. And when you open traffic in our Arctic sea lanes, that can be cruise ships, which have already sailed. So what do you do when the cruise ship docks at Inuvik and someone gets off the ship and, do you have a customs infrastructure? Do you have an RCMP infrastructure to manage that? Submarines which use the northern waters as potential launch sites for ICBMs. Well, now that you are able to patrol it, what you do if you find it. So those are all the various questions, let alone what climate does in other areas that are of interest to Canada, and what that does to people, to migration, to economic well-being. All of those things have impact on Canada, internationally and domestically.
Thank you, George. Ferry?
Oh, just a few points, because I think George covered the whole waterfront. I think that what we also mention in Strategic Outlook is the need for open borders when you fight fires. That is, if there's a fire between Canada and the US, whether the Canadaires are on one side or the other, irrelevant. So you don't wait for an authorization to cross the border. I think those are simple things that have to be done. I think there's also an interesting thing, a kind of a common work by legal experts on the management of claims for wildfires that have affected people around. I think those are simple stuff, but they're not happening. How do you manage the claims of people who have lost their house, their cattle, and whatever? And I think there should be a greater integration of how you approach these issues, as opposed to one by one, which usually fill more the pocket of the lawyers than the actual people who necessitate the assistance. So and I think that there's a very simple recommendation that talks about improving the anti-fire capabilities of houses, of barns, of whatever can protect the cattle, and all of those things have to be done. They seem to be very normal. We would have expected that, since the climate change is not a new phenomenon, that things like that would have already been done. But no, it's a bit like when we talk about the COVID-19, where all of a sudden the sense of community disappears and it's each to its own, and the rest, I don't care. And I think that's one of the issues that has to be looked at as well from the climate change perspective. So I don't think I've got to add anything else to what George very well eloquently says.
I want to thank you both first for the paper, which was really useful, and I heard a lot of people at the conference comment on how useful it was to have something that substantial and comprehensive to get their teeth into. So thank you very much for that, and for your agreeing to expand a little bit on your thinking here today.
That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.